If a noble baroness thought dead was saved by a lonely rancher in the middle of a snowbound massacre, would she return to the wealth and title that once caged her, or bury the past to embrace a simple defiant love on the untamed frontier? The silence of winter was a language Silas Blackwood understood. It spoke in the whisper of wind through the skeletal arms of aspens and the heavy muffled fall of new snow. He rode his stout gelding Orion at a pace that conserved warmth, his breath pluming in the frigid air like a ghost of the life he once lived. There had been a time when he'd ridden with purpose, chasing horizons and deadlines, but that was before the fever took Sarah, before the world shrank to the four walls of the cabin he'd built for her, a place now haunted by the echo of her absence. He was just a man with shoulders broadened by labor and grief, his hands scarred from both timber and loss. Orion stopped without a command, his ears pinned back, his warm breath fogging the air in short, nervous bursts. The scent on the wind was wrong, acrid smoke and something metallic coppery that cut through the clean smell of pine and snow. Silas dismounted his boots, sinking into the fresh powder with a soft crunch. He pulled the thick wool scarf higher over his face, his eyes scanning the clearing ahead. The scene was a violation against the white canvas of the landscape. A large wagon, one of its wheels shattered into a wooden starburst, lay on its side like a slaughtered beast. Thick, dark smoke still curled lazily from its charred remains. Bodies lay scattered, their forms stark against the snow, their winter cloaks and heavy coats not enough to protect them from the final cold. It was a massacre, brutal and absolute. He saw the track-shod horses, at least a dozen of them had come and gone, leaving the churned, blood-stained snow as the only testament to their fury. These weren't hungry men. This was cruelty for its own sake, a rage unleashed upon the innocent. He moved through the wreckage with a heavy heart, his steps deliberate. He had no prayers to offer, only the grim respect of a fellow traveler acknowledging the end of another's journey. A child's mitten, bright red, lay half buried in the snow, a vibrant splash of color in the monochrome tragedy. The sight twisted something deep inside him, a cold knot of a pain he thought had long gone numb. He was about to turn away to leave the dead to the silence and the coming night when he heard it. It was barely a sound, a faint hitching gasp, almost indistinguishable from the sigh of the wind. His gaze swept the area again, more intently this time. Tucked behind the overturned wagon, sheltered from the wind, was a heap of fur and heavy wool. He approached cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of the hunting knife at his belt. As he drew closer, he saw a cascade of dark hair fanned out against the snow like spilled ink. A woman. She was curled into a tight ball, wrapped in a magnificent fur-lined cloak that was torn and stained with blood. Her face was pale as marble, streaked with soot and frozen tears. One hand, encased in a fine leather glove, was clutched to her chest. The other, bare and bruised, lay in the snow, her fingers curled as if grasping for something no longer there. He knelt, his knee sinking into the deep drift. He held his own chapped fingers near her lips and felt it, a fragile puff of warmth. She was alive. She was older than a girl, a woman whose face, even in its current state, held a quiet, defiant elegance. Her dress, though tattered, was of a quality he hadn't seen in years, its dark velvet, a stark contrast to the homespun wool of the other victims. Without a second thought, he slipped his powerful arms beneath her. She was lighter than he expected, as if the horror had already burned away part of her substance. Her head lolled against his chest, a dead weight. Orion snorted as Silas mounted, the scent of blood sharp in the horse's nostrils, but he stood steady. The sun was a bleeding wound on the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the snow-covered plains. Silas didn't look back at the carnage. His cabin was a few miles west, nestled into a hollow and shielded by a dense stand of ancient pines. It was his sanctuary, his prison, the place he'd retreated to when the world became too loud with memories of Sarah. He nudged Orion into a steady walk, the woman cradled against his chest. Her life felt as fragile as a flickering candle flame in the face of the encroaching, freezing night. And as he rode, a question formed in his mind, unwelcome and persistent. After spending 3 years trying to forget how to feel, why was he fighting so hard to save this stranger? The fire in the stone hearth was the living heart of the cabin, casting a warm amber glow that pushed back against the encroaching gloom. The wind howled outside, a mournful, lonely sound that rattled the window panes. Silas had laid the woman on his own bed, Sarah's bed, the thickest furs and wool blankets piled high around her. Her breathing was shallow but consistent, a small victory against the cold that had tried to claim her. He worked with a quiet efficiency born of long practice. He melted snow for water, his hands gentle as he cleaned the gash on her forehead. It was a shallow wound, but it had bled profusely, matting her dark hair. Her other injuries were bruises, dark and ugly, blooming across her skin like poisonous flowers. He wrapped her scraped bare hand in linen soaked in a soothing salve, his touch surprisingly deft for a man whose hands were so calloused. He sat in the worn armchair by the fire, the one Sarah had always claimed, and watched the rise and fall of her chest. He didn't sleep. Sleep brought dreams, and his dreams were battlegrounds of memory he preferred to avoid. Instead, he watched over the stranger, this piece of a broken world that had washed up on his doorstep. He felt a flicker of something he couldn't name, a sense of duty perhaps, or maybe just the profound loneliness of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to have another living soul under his roof. Morning arrived not with a dawn, but with a slow, grudging lightening of the gray sky. A fresh blanket of snow had fallen overnight, softening the edges of the world, burying the tracks of his journey home. The woman stirred, a soft moan escaping her lips. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened. Her eyes were the color of a stormy sea, a turbulent blue-gray filled with a terrifying confusion. They darted around the rustic cabin, taking in the rough-hewn log walls, the simple wooden furniture, the drying herbs hanging from the rafters, and finally him. Fear stark and primal flared in their depths. She tried to push herself up, a sharp gasp of pain cutting the movement short. "Easy now, Silas," said his voice, a low rumble rough from disuse. "You're safe here." She stared at him, her mind clearly struggling to piece together the fragments of a nightmare. "Where?" Her voice was a dry, raspy whisper. "My cabin. I found you at the wagon site." He saw the memory hit her, a wave of horror that washed the last vestiges of color from her face. Her eyes widened, then squeezed shut as if to block out the images replaying in her mind. The others, Silas's jaw tightened. "You were the only one." A single tear escaped from beneath her closed eyelid, tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She didn't sob or scream. The grief was a silent, crushing weight. He felt a profound, aching pity for her. He knew that silence. It was the sound of a world ending. He brought her a mug of warm broth, holding it to her lips. She drank, her eyes still closed, her body trembling with a combination of cold shock and pain. When she was done, she sank back into the pillows, exhausted. "You have a name?" he asked after a long silence, his voice gentle. Her eyes opened again, but they were distant, unfocused. She looked down at her gloved hand, then at her bare one. A long moment passed. I can't remember." He heard the lie. It wasn't in her words, but in the subtle tension in her jaw, the way her gaze refused to meet his. He didn't challenge it. A name was a chain to a past, and hers was a past littered with death. If she needed to be nameless for a while, who was he to deny her that small mercy? "All right," he said, nodding slowly. "Rest then. We'll let it come back when it's ready." For 3 days, the snow fell without ceasing, isolating the cabin, completely turning it into a small, self-contained world. She slept most of the time, a deep, healing sleep that was often punctuated by muffled cries. Silas moved about his chores, tending his animals in the small barn, chopping wood, his movements slow and deliberate. He would come inside, stamping the snow from his boots, and find her awake, staring at the flames in the hearth, her expression unreadable. He learned the landscape of her grief. It was in the way she flinched at the sound of the wind, the way her hands would clench in her sleep, the profound bone-deep weariness in her eyes. He never pushed her to talk. He simply existed in the space with her, his quiet presence, a steady anchor in the storm of her trauma. On the 4th morning, the storm broke. The sun, pale and weak, glittered on a world transformed, a pristine expanse of white. She was strong enough to walk to the door, wrapped in one of his heavy wool coats, the sleeves ridiculously long on her. He found her standing there, staring out at the endless snow. "I needed to see the sky," she whispered, her voice still fragile. "To know the world hadn't vanished." "It's still here," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Doesn't much care if we're looking or not." She turned to look at him, then her gaze direct and searching for the first time. The storm in her eyes had calmed, leaving behind a deep, settled sorrow. "Why did you help me? You could have left me." Silas looked out at the vast, indifferent landscape. "My wife, Sarah. She always said that the worst thing a person can do is walk away when they can help. Said it leaves a hole in you bigger than the one you leave in them." He paused, the memory of Sarah's voice a bittersweet ache. "I guess I just didn't need another hole." A flicker of understanding passed between them, a shared acknowledgement of loss. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He just nodded. They stood in silence for a long time, two solitary figures, against a backdrop of white, their breath, mingling in the cold air. A fragile thread of trust, spun from shared silence and unspoken grief, began to form between them. In the vast frozen wilderness, they were no longer completely alone. The days that followed were measured in the slow rhythm of survival and healing. A quiet, unspoken routine settled over the cabin, as natural and necessary as the rising and setting of the winter sun. Silas would rise in the pre-dawn dark, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and build up the fire until it roared with life. The woman who remained nameless would wake to the smell of coffee and wood smoke, the two scents weaving a strange kind of comfort around her. She began to help, her movements initially hesitant and clumsy, but growing more confident with each passing day. She would peel potatoes for their stew, her slender fingers still bruised, working with a surprising determination. She learned to mend his worn shirts, her stitches small and precise, a stark contrast to the rough functional repairs he made himself. It was a language of small gestures, of shared tasks that spoke more than words ever could. One afternoon, while a gentle snow was falling outside, she found a small whittled bird on the mantelpiece. It was crudely carved but imbued with a certain charm. She picked it up, her thumb tracing the smooth lines of the pine. "Did you make this?" she asked, her voice soft. Silas looked up from the harness he was oiling. He nodded, a faint flush creeping up his neck. "Something to do with my hands. Sarah." She liked birds, the woman he had taken to calling her Annabelle in the privacy of his own mind, for she seemed to possess a quiet, resilient grace that the name suggested placed the bird back on the mantel with reverence. "It's beautiful." He didn't know how to respond to the compliment, so he just grunted and focused on his work, but her words warmed a small cold corner of his heart. As her physical strength returned, so did fragments of her old self. One evening she began to hum as she stirred their dinner, a complex, melancholic melody that sounded utterly out of place in the rustic cabin. Silas stopped what he was doing, listening. The tune was heartbreakingly beautiful, full of a longing that resonated with his own. "That's a sad song," he said when she trailed off, her cheeks coloring in embarrassment. "It's a lullaby," she replied, her gaze fixed on the pot. From before. He knew before meant the massacre, but he also sensed it meant a life much further back than that. Her accent, subtle but present, was not of these parts. It was refined, educated. Her hands, despite their recent injuries, were not the hands of a farmer's wife. They were hands that knew softness, hands that had perhaps never known a day of hard labor until now. A week later, Silas had to make a trip to the nearest settlement, a rough-and-tumble town, a day's ride away, for supplies. He was reluctant to leave her, a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years rising in him. "I'll be fine," she insisted, her chin lifted with a stubborn pride he was coming to recognize. "I'm not a child. The snow is deep, and there are wolves," he countered, his brow furrowed with worry. "And there is a rifle over the hearth that I have watched you clean a dozen times," she shot back. "I know how to use it." His eyes widened in surprise. She met his gaze without flinching. There were layers to this woman, depths he had not yet begun to plumb. He relented, leaving her with a stack of firewood that reached the ceiling and more food than she could possibly eat in his absence. While he was gone, a profound quiet settled over the cabin. Annabelle found herself wandering its small space, touching Silas's belongings, the worn handle of his axe, the chipped rim of his favorite mug, the faded photograph of a smiling woman with kind eyes that sat on a small shelf. Sarah. She felt a pang of something she couldn't identify, not jealousy, but a deep, sorrowful respect for the love that had clearly filled this home. Driven by a need to do something, to create rather than just exist, she found a sack of flour. She remembered watching her family's cook make bread, the rhythmic push and pull of the kneading. She worked from memory, her movements clumsy at first, but then falling into a rhythm. She found a strange solace in the act, in feeling the dough come alive under her hands. When Silas returned 2 days later, weary and cold, the first thing that hit him as he opened the cabin door was the smell. It was the warm, yeasty, impossibly comforting scent of freshly baked bread. It was a smell he hadn't experienced in 3 years. It was the smell of home. He stopped dead in the doorway, his pack slipping from his shoulder to the floor. Annabelle stood by the hearth, a smudge of flour on her cheek, her eyes wide and uncertain, as if she expected him to be angry. A loaf of golden brown bread, imperfectly shaped but undeniably real, sat cooling on the table. For a moment, Silas couldn't breathe. The scent, the sight, it was like a ghost of Sarah had risen in the room. But then he looked at Annabelle, at her hopeful, anxious face, and the ghost receded. This wasn't the past. This was something new. He walked to the table, picked up the knife, and sliced off a thick heel from the loaf. Steam rose from the cut. He took a bite, the rough crust giving way to a soft, warm interior. He closed his eyes. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He opened his eyes and looked at her. He didn't say thank you. The words felt too small. Instead, he simply said, "You stayed." A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine smile he had ever seen from her. It transformed her, chasing the shadows from her eyes. "You came back," she replied. In that moment, something shifted between them. The fragile thread of trust thickened, strengthened, weaving itself into the beginnings of a bond. They were no longer just a rescuer and a survivor. They were two lonely people in a vast, cold world who had just discovered the profound, life-affirming warmth of a shared loaf of bread. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet transformation. The winter held its grip on the land, but inside the small cabin, a tentative spring was beginning to bloom. The shared bread had broken more than just their hunger. It had broken the spell of their isolation. They began to talk not of their pasts, but of small things. The stubbornness of the old goat, the way the snow looked like diamond dust in the morning sun, the best wood for a long burning fire. Silas found himself watching her, constantly fascinated by the woman emerging from the shell of the traumatized victim. She had a quick, intelligent mind and a dry wit that took him by surprise. She also had a fierce, unyielding pride. She refused to be idle, insisting on carrying her share of the workload, her movements growing more graceful and efficient each day. One evening, a blizzard descended upon them, a roaring tempest of wind and snow that shook the very foundations of the cabin. The world outside vanished into a swirling vortex of white. They were trapped, marooned together in their small arc of warmth and light. The roar of the wind seemed to stir the ghosts between them. Annabelle stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the storm. In another life, she said, her voice barely a whisper above the howl of the wind, "I think I lived by the sea. I remember the sound of it, a roar like this, but full of life, not emptiness." Silas moved to stand beside her, his presence a solid, comforting weight in the tumultuous dark. "I've never seen the sea," he confessed. "Farthest I ever got was a river in flood season, looked angry enough to swallow the whole world." She turned her head, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "The sea isn't always angry. Sometimes it's calm like glass. You can see your own face in it, and for a moment you feel like you're part of something immense." Her voice trailed off, her eyes clouded with a memory that was both beautiful and painful. He saw the longing in her face, the shadow of a life so different from this one it might as well have been on another planet. He felt a sudden, fierce urge to protect her, not just from the cold or the wolves, but from the memories that haunted her. The next time he went to town after the blizzard had passed, he saw it in the back of the general store, covered in a dusty canvas sheet. It was an old upright piano, its wood scarred and faded. The storekeeper, a crusty old man named Jed, said it had been there for years, taken as payment for a debt. "Things out of tune and a few of the keys stick," Jed grumbled. "You can have it for the price of a good mule." Silas thought of the melody she had hummed, the longing in her eyes when she spoke of the sea. He thought of her hands, so delicate and yet so strong. He looked at the money he had saved, money he had no purpose for, and made a decision that felt both insane and absolutely necessary. Getting the piano back to the cabin was a monumental effort. He had to trade his best hunting knife for the use of a heavy sled and a team of oxen. The journey was slow and arduous, the massive instrument a dead weight that threatened to bog them down in the deep snowdrifts. But Silas was driven by a purpose he hadn't felt since he'd built the cabin for Sarah. When he finally wrestled it through the door, Annabelle just stared. Her face was a mask of disbelief, her stormy eyes wide with 1,000 unspoken questions. She approached it as if it were a sacred object, her hand trembling as she lifted the lid that covered the keys. She ran her fingers lightly over the yellowed ivory, a soft, dusty chord hanging in the air. She didn't play that night or the next. She would simply sit on the stool he had made for her, her hands resting on the keys, her eyes closed. It was as if she was reacquainting herself with a lost part of her own soul. Then one evening, as Silas sat by the fire mending a leather strap, she began to play. The notes were hesitant, at first stumbling as her fingers sought to remember old familiar paths. The melody was fragmented, a ghost of a song. But then something shifted. Her fingers grew more confident, the music swelling to fill the small cabin. It was a piece full of soaring passion and heartbreaking sorrow. It spoke of ballrooms and chandeliers, of lost love and profound regret. It was the sound of the sea she had described, both tempestuous and calm. It was the sound of her soul. Silas stopped his work, his hands still. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. It wasn't just a tune. It was a story, her story told in a language more powerful than words. In that music he heard the echo of her privileged past, the pain of her losses, and the resilient spark of the woman who had survived. When the last note faded into silence, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Annabelle sat with her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Silas went to her, placing a large, gentle hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, her face wet with tears, but her eyes were clear as if a storm had finally broken. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," he said, his voice thick with emotion. It was the most beautiful, honest thing I've ever heard. He understood then. He had not just brought a piece of furniture into his home. He had brought her voice, and as she leaned into his touch, a silent acknowledgement of his profound gift, he knew with a terrifying certainty that this woman was no longer just a stranger he was sheltering. She was becoming a part of him. The music changed everything. It was as if the piano had unlocked a door inside Annabelle, and now her true self was slowly, cautiously stepping out. She played every day, the melodies growing stronger, more complex. The cabin, once a bastion of silent grief, was now filled with the sound of her reclaimed memories. With this newfound voice came a new confidence. She began to speak of her past, not in a flood of confession, but in small, glittering fragments that she would offer him like precious gifts. She spoke of a childhood spent in a sprawling stone house that smelled of beeswax and old books, of learning to ride horses, not for work, but for sport, of a father who had taught her the names of the constellations. She never spoke of the massacre. That door remained firmly shut, and Silas never tried to force it open. He understood that some sorrows were too vast to be put into words. Their intimacy grew not in leaps and bounds, but in the quiet, steady accretion of shared moments. It was in the way she would look up from the piano and smile at him, a genuine, unguarded smile. It was in the way he would leave a wildflower he'd found pushing through the snow on her pillow. It was in the comfortable silence that could now stretch between them. A silence no longer filled with ghosts, but with a quiet understanding. He came to know the woman. She was fiercely intelligent, deeply compassionate, and possessed of a core of strength, as unyielding as the granite mountains that surrounded them. He found himself falling in love with her, a slow, terrifying, and utterly inevitable fall. It was a love so different from what he'd shared with Sarah. His love for Sarah had been the bright, easy warmth of a summer day. This was the fierce, precious heat of a fire in the dead of winter, a love born of survival and necessity. A love that knew the profound darkness that lay just outside its circle of light. One crisp, sunny morning, Annabelle announced her intention to ride to town with him. "I can't hide in this cabin forever, Silas. I need to see if I can walk among people again." He felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach, but he saw the resolve in her eyes and knew he couldn't deny her this. "All right," he said, "but you stay close." The town was a shock to her system after weeks of isolation. The noise, the smells, the press of strange bodies, it was overwhelming. She wore one of Sarah's old winter cloaks, the hood pulled low to shadow her face, and clung to Silas's arm like a lifeline. They were in the general store, Silas negotiating for a new axe head, while Annabelle browsed the meager selection of sewing threads, when she heard a voice that froze the blood in her veins. Good God, it cannot be. The voice was cultured, clipped, utterly alien in this rough-hewn place. She turned slowly, her heart pounding against her ribs. A man stood near the counter, his winter coat tailored and expensive, his face clean-shaven. He was staring at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Baroness," he breathed, taking a hesitant step toward her. "Baroness de Courcy. We were told you perished. Your uncle, he has been searching for months." The title fell into the quiet store like a dropped bomb. The few other customers turned to stare. Silas, hearing the commotion, turned from the counter, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. Annabelle felt the world tilt on its axis. The life she had so brutally fled had found her. The name she had tried to bury in the snow had been resurrected. She looked at the man, a distant cousin she barely recognized, and saw in his face the entire gilded cage she had escaped. "You are mistaken," she said, her voice low and trembling with a cold fury. "That woman is dead. But your face, it is unmistakably you," the man stammered, confused. "What are you doing in a place like this, dressed in rags?" "I am living," she said, her voice gaining strength, "which is more than I ever did before. Now, if you'll excuse me, I suggest you forget you ever saw me." She turned, grabbing Silas's arm, and pulled him toward the door. She didn't look back. They mounted their horses and rode out of town, the man's shocked face burned into her memory. The ride back was silent and tense. Annabelle rode with her back ramrod straight her face, a pale, unreadable mask. When they reached the cabin, she slid from her horse and walked to the edge of the clearing, staring out at the snow-capped mountains. Silas followed her, stopping a few feet behind. He waited. Finally, she spoke, her back still to him. "My name is Annabelle de Courcy. I am the only child of the late Baron Adrien de Courcy, and I am heir to a fortune I never wanted and a title I despise." The words poured out of her, then a torrent of truth held back for too long. She told him of her suffocating life, of the endless expectations of being treated as a valuable commodity, to be married off to the highest bidder. She told him of her uncle, a cold, calculating man who saw her as a key to increasing the family's power. "I was being sent to marry a duke, a man 3 times my age with a reputation for cruelty," she said, her voice raw with remembered disgust. "I was property being traded. So I ran. I took what jewels I could hide and paid for passage on that wagon under a false name. I was heading west anywhere just to disappear, to become someone else. Or maybe just to become myself for the first time." She finally turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a mixture of defiance and vulnerability. "I never meant to deceive you, Silas. I was just surviving." He looked at her, at this incredible, courageous woman who had shed a life of unimaginable privilege for the simple, brutal chance to be free. And the love he felt for her swelled in his chest until it was a physical ache. He stepped closer, closing the space between them. He reached out and cupped her face in his large, warm hands. "Annabelle," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I have never cared what your name was. I didn't save a baroness from that wreck. I found a woman who was fighting to breathe on her own. And that's the woman I've watched every day since. That's the woman I see standing in front of me right now." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "But who am I now?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "If I'm not her, and I'm not just a nameless survivor, who am I? You're the woman who fills my home with music." He said, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "You're the woman who burns the bread but tries again the next day. You're the woman who taught a man who thought his life was over that he was wrong. That's who you are. And it's more than enough." Her breath hitched in a sob and she collapsed against him, her arms wrapping around his waist, her face buried in the rough wool of his coat. He held her tightly, his own eyes burning. He was holding his entire world in his arms. The past had found them, but instead of tearing them apart, it had forged the final unbreakable link in the chain of their love. That night she didn't sleep in her own small bed. She came to his, her movements hesitant in the firelight. He lifted the blankets, and she slipped in beside him. There was no passion, not yet. It was something deeper, more profound. It was the simple, sacred act of 2 souls finding shelter in one another. They lay facing each other in the dark, not touching, but their breaths mingling in the cold air. For the first time in a long time, neither of them felt alone. The morning after her confession was quiet, but it was a new kind of quiet. The silence was no longer a space to hide secrets, but a comfortable stillness shared by 2 people who knew each other completely. Annabelle rose before Silas, moving through the cabin with a newfound lightness, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. When Silas awoke, he found her sitting at the table, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered peaks in hues of rose and gold. She looked at him, and for the first time since he had known her, her eyes were completely clear, free of the storm that had clouded them for so long. "I will not live in fear," she said, her voice calm and resolute. "My uncle will send others. That man in town will talk. They will come for me." "Then let them come, Silas," replied his voice, a low growl of pure protective instinct. "This is your home now. They'll have to come through me to get to you." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "That's a promise that could get you killed, Silas Blackwood. It's a promise I'm prepared to keep." The threat of the outside world hung over them, but instead of driving them apart, it drew them closer. Their days took on a new urgency, a new preciousness. Every shared meal, every piece of music played, every walk through the silent, snow-draped woods felt like a small act of defiance. Their love, which had grown in the quiet solitude of the cabin, now became their shield. One afternoon, Silas led her to a place she had never been, a small, sheltered grove of ancient pines at the edge of his property. The snow lay thick and undisturbed here. In the center of the grove stood a single weathered wooden cross. "This is where I buried Sarah," he said, his voice soft. He had never spoken of the grave, and Annabelle knew this was a sacred offering. "I came here every day for a year. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life talking to a ghost." He turned to face her, his eyes full of a raw, honest emotion that took her breath away. "I thought my heart was buried here with her. I thought I knew what love was, and that my share of it was used up. But you, Annabelle, you walked out of a nightmare and into my life. And you taught me that a heart can break and still learn to beat again. You taught me that it can even learn to love again. Stronger, maybe. Deeper. Because now I know what it costs. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow. She stepped toward him, placing her hand over his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beat beneath her palm. And you, she said, her voice thick with emotion, you gave me a safe harbor in the middle of the storm. You never asked me to be anything other than what I was. You saw me when I couldn't even see myself. I think I've been falling in love with you since the moment I woke up in this cabin. I know I have, he whispered. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of profound recognition. It was a kiss that sealed every unspoken promise, every shared glance, every moment of fear and hope they had endured together. It was the kiss of two broken souls finding their whole world in each other. They were still standing in the grove when they heard the horses. Not one, but three approaching the cabin at a determined pace. Silas's hand immediately went to the pistol he now wore at his hip. They moved back toward the cabin, their hands clasped together, a silent, united front. Three men dismounted in the clearing. One was her cousin from town. The other two were hard-faced men with the cold, empty eyes of hired guns. Annabelle, her cousin, said, his voice strained. This is foolishness. Your uncle sent us to bring you home. There are arrangements that must be honored. My name is Annabelle de Courcy, she said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority, an echo of the baroness she once was, but now wielded for her own purpose. And I am home. She squeezed Silas's hand. This is my home, and this is the man I choose. You would choose this. This peasant, her cousin, sneered, his gaze sweeping over Silas with disdain. Over your birthright, your family. The man who saved my life over the family. That would have sold it. Yes. Without hesitation, she replied, her voice like ice. The two hired guns shifted their hands, moving toward their weapons. You're not taking her, Silas, said his voice dangerously low. He stepped slightly in front of Annabelle, shielding her with his body. The air crackled with tension. The silence of the winter woods was broken only by the nervous stamping of the horses. You can't stop us woodsmen, one of the men said with a cruel smile. I can try, Silas said, and I can promise you this. You might take her, but not all of you will be riding home. There was a finality in his tone, an absolute conviction that gave the men pause. They saw in his eyes not the fear of a cornered farmer, but the resolve of a man with nothing left to lose, and therefore everything to fight for. Annabelle stepped out from behind him to stand at his side. She looked her cousin directly in the eye. Go back, she said, her voice commanding. Tell my uncle that the Baroness de Courcy died in the snow. Tell him I buried her myself. The woman who stands here is Annabelle Blackwood, and she is not for sale. Her cousin stared at her, at the transformation, at the unyielding strength in her face. He saw that the frightened girl he remembered was gone, replaced by a formidable woman. He looked at Silas, at his quiet, deadly resolve, and at the unforgiving wilderness that surrounded them. He made a decision. He gave a curt nod to his men, and without another word they mounted their horses and rode away, their dark forms disappearing into the trees. When they were gone, Annabelle leaned her head against Silas's shoulder, a long, shuddering breath escaping her lips. It was over. That evening, as the stars blazed with a cold, brilliant fire in the winter sky, Silas took her hand. Annabelle Blackwood, you said. I did, she whispered, her heart fluttering. It has a good sound to it, he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple braided ring of silver he had bought in town. Marry me, Annabelle. Be my wife. Let's build a life here, just the two of us against the world. She looked from the ring to his face, his beloved weathered face, and saw her future, her safety, her heart's true home. Yes, she breathed, tears of joy tracing paths down her cheeks. Oh yes, Silas. I will marry you. They were married by the circuit preacher a week later, standing in the grove, the pines their witnesses. She wore a simple dress she had sewn herself. He wore his best clean shirt. They didn't need a grand cathedral or a crowd of onlookers. Their love was a cathedral built of survival trust and the quiet, miraculous healing of two lonely hearts who had found their home in the heart of a relentless winter. And as they stood hand in hand, the winter sun shining down on them, They knew that while the world outside might be cold and unforgiving, the warmth they had built together was enough to last a lifetime. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.